Part 3. Introductory Concepts. There are three general approaches of conceiving of and calculating student growth. Each approach to calculating and interpreting growth has its own advantages, disadvantages, and challenges. First, we could think of growth as an amount of change, that is, a gain from time 1 to time 2. Second, we could think of growth as norm or peer-referenced quantity. And third, we could think of growth as a criterion-referenced quantity. First, let's consider growth as an amount of change. Growth as an amount of change is also referred to as gain or loss. Like height or weight, just calculate the amount of change. Growth is the amount of something at time 2 minus the amount of the same thing at time 1. With test scores, growth is the score at time 2, say on a post-test, minus the score at time 1 on a pre-test. Although calculations are simple, interpreting growth is not as simple as it seems. Interpreting change requires context. Comparison of simple gains scores between students often leads to the wrong conclusions, as we'll see in the next couple of sections. It also requires a single scale across tests, referred to in testing as a vertical scale, which North Carolina doesn't have on its state assessments, but might exist on some interim assessments administered by districts. Now let's consider growth as a norm or peer-referenced quantity. Peer-based analyses are also called norm-referenced analyses. As with infant height or weight charts, peers are children or students with similar relevant characteristics. For growth analyses using large-scale assessments, peers are students with at least the same scale score history on the same tests. Peer-based norms are invaluable in providing context for stakeholders to understand student growth. As we saw in our high jumpers example, it made little sense to compare Judy's and Anna's progress directly to each other. It would make much more sense, however, to make such comparisons to their respective peers. Most approaches to calculating student growth on large-scale assessments use such a peer-based approach in some way. Our third approach to calculating growth scores is to consider growth as a criterion reference quantity. Regardless of whether growth is considered or computed as an amount of change or as a norm or peer reference quantity, in educational settings there is often a desire to know whether that level of growth is adequate. Was there enough growth? Answering questions such as was there enough growth does not require a new growth score, but does require a criterion against which to compare a student's growth score. Like with the growth score, the criterion itself can be norm or peer referenced. For example, the amount of growth that is typical for all students, or a particular group of students, that like the top 25% of students in a class. Or it can be criterion referenced and expressed as an amount of change, such as the amount of growth needed to reach a particular achievement level in a certain amount of time, or the amount of change needed to be on track to college and career readiness. Activity 3. Context and Questions. In a 2007 article, measurement specialist Wendy Yen identified several growth-related questions commonly asked by parents and teachers. Begin by selecting one question from the parent list and one from the teacher list. Consider and discuss how you might use information from a summative assessment such as the state EOG tests, interim assessment, or information from your classroom to answer each of the questions. Discuss your answers, and then you can cycle through the rest of the questions on your own.